Julie Herrada. I'm 64. I live in Salina, Michigan, which is just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I'm the youngest of four children. My father was a first generation American citizen, born in Detroit in 1928. His parents came from Mexico by way of Texas and then to Detroit in 1920 to work in the auto industry. Um, my father's parents, this is a little bit of a backstory too. Um, they came, well, Henry Ford was offering $5 a day to unskilled workers to come to Detroit because they just didn't have enough workers in the United States. So they had to invite workers from other countries. So many people came. And at that time, they didn't even require, um, a passport or birth certificate or anything like that. You could just come and you could, start living your life. You could raise a family, build a home, and all that. So that's what they did. And they had five children during this time up until the Great Depression. And so in the very early late 1920s, um, everybody was laid off from their jobs. So and there wasn't anything like unemployment insurance or Medicaid or anything like that to support the unemployed workers. So a lot of people suffered greatly. And there were, hunger strikes and hunger marches, and people were literally starving. And my grandparents, they didn't want to leave the US, but they also could not support their children. So they decided to send their five children at that time to Mexico to live with my paternal grandmother, my grandfather's mother. And so she would take care of them while my grandparents stayed in Detroit and looked for work. And it turns out that my grandfather did get a job with the WPA. So he was able to send money home to his mother to take care of the children. So a couple years go by and they find out that his mother was giving the money to the Catholic Church instead of taking care of the children. So he got very angry and he sent for the children and they came back to Detroit. And I think this was after a couple of years. And the kids didn't no longer spoke English and they were impoverished, they were malnourished. So that made him turn on the Catholic Church for the rest of his life. He hated the church after that. And so after they came back to Detroit, they ended up having a few more children and raising their kids and never having to go back. But as a result of that, it was very traumatic for a lot of families. They never again lived in the Mexican community. They kind of assimilated as best they could because they didn't want to be targeted, because there was a lot of pressure on people to go to Mexico who weren't born in the US. At that time, Diego Rivera was also advocating for people to return to Mexico and farm the land and such, but the land was arid. It was depression everywhere. So those plans didn't really work out for most people. And some people never did come back to the U.S., but my father and his siblings, they were all born in the U.S. They're all citizens of the U.S., so they were able to come back and just pick up their lives again as best they could. So my grandfather, my grandmother on my mother's side was born in Dublin, Ontario. And so she was a Canadian citizen, and she came to the U.S. with her parents as a young woman. She was already an adult by then. And so she set up her life in Detroit as well. And so my parents both met in Detroit. And my grandmother had been a labor organizer. And I don't know a lot about the details of that time, but she was a great influence on me. And I spent a lot of time with her growing up. And she lived with us for a number of years. She was a devout Catholic, but also she liked to drink beer. She enjoyed having fun. She would always sit on the front porch in the summer, warm summer months, and drink her beer, and we'd hang out. And she also taught me how to sabotage the produce that was being boycotted in the grocery stores. So there was a boycott against this brand of iceberg lettuce called Red Coach. And there was also a boycott against grapes, as most people are aware of. So we would go into the stores and like stick our thumbs into the Red Coach lettuce and smash the grapes on the shelf. And we never bought produce, like we never bought boycotted produce when I was a kid. It wasn't until the boycotts ended when we started buying grapes in our family. My grandmother lived to be 93. She was a staunch Democrat and was always for the workers. And so that was an influence on me also. I mean, my family were staunch Democrats all around, and there was never any question about where their affinities lied. My father had been drafted into the Korean War. Although he didn't see combat, he was stationed in Japan. His two best friends in the army were a white man and a black man. And so the Korean War was the first war the U.S. was involved in that was integrated, racially integrated, because I think the integration laws came for the military in like after World War II in the late 40s. So by the early 50s, it was fully integrated. And so he came back from the war, and he had been working at Chrysler before he left for Korea. And then when he came back, he was able to get his job back. And even the seniority, he was able to get the seniority. So things were pretty good for auto workers at that time. And he kind of worked his way up. And he was in the shop, and then he was a clerk typist in the office. And then they noticed that he had a skill for drawing. He was a good artist. And they had a school that they would send their workers to for engineering. So they sent him to engineering school. It was called Chrysler Institute. So without ever having to leave and go to school or anything, he became an engineer and stayed working at Chrysler for the rest of his career, which was like 40 some years. And the other reason that he stayed at Chrysler all that time is because it was the only big three company, the other two being Ford and GM, who allowed their white collar workers to stay in the union. So he was always a UAW member, even as a white collar worker, and he would have to go out on strike occasionally and picket, and he was very devoted to the union cause. Although I don't know if he actually ever played any other roles in the union. And my mom waited. My mom had always worked too, and she had when I started kindergarten, so I was the youngest, and I started kindergarten, she started nursing school. So she became a nurse and worked as a nurse for the rest of her career until she was in her 50s. And my mother and my grandmother were, I wasn't really a political activist as a young child, but they were very supportive of like general mischief. So, they were, my grandmother hated nosy neighbors, and my mother would advocate for me going out and, just creating havoc in the neighborhood. And so, so that's the kind of upbringing I had. Let's see. Oh, my grandfather on my father's side was also an advocate of Esperanto. And I don't really know what his involvement was in that, but I know that he would talk about it, and he would write letters to people advocating for the use of Esperanto. Unlike a lot of the people that you've interviewed for this series, I was not a teenage activist or a teenage, anarchist or anything like that. I was a teenage troublemaker. I always worked from the time I was like 11 or 12, babysitting jobs, and then working in restaurants or whatever. I always had jobs, but I would skip school a lot. And if I did go to school, I would go to school to buy drugs, and I would get high, and I would go to the store and get beer and drink beer. And then I would go out with my friends, and I would, have money to spend on those things. Plus I went to a lot of concerts, and I bought my own clothes. And, I was pretty independent as a teenager. My parents had already raised 3 kids, and I think they were just kind of like done with that. Like, okay, okay, you're on your own. And they fairly well trusted me because I didn't get arrested and I didn't really get into serious trouble. I just kind of did what I wanted. And so when I graduated from high school, I left home right away. And then I worked in a series of very shit jobs. And one of them was in a factory where we made the parts that go inside the door to crank the windows up and down. They were these metal parts. And it was a small shop and it was non-union. And I know that they sold their parts to the big three, but this shop was non-union and they didn't treat the workers very well. And after a while, a few months I was working there and I started to talk about unions because that's how I grew up. There were unions everywhere. And one of the workers there told me, well, the last time somebody mentioned union in this shop, everybody was fired. So they just they shut me out. They just totally turned their backs on me. So I said, okay, well, that's that. And then I worked for a little while longer, but the conditions became increasingly worse. And I knew that that was not what I wanted to be doing with my life. My older sister had gone to college and she was the first one in our family, in our immediate family, to go to college. And I got the idea from her that I could actually go to college. Like I never thought of myself as college material and I never liked school. I always thought school was like prison. So, but then I thought, well, this is even worse. Working these shit jobs is even worse than that. It's got to be better. So I went to college. I took out Pell Grants and I paid my own way through college. And the college that I went to was, people in my family also didn't go away to college. So the college that was like the no-brainer where I was going to go is Wayne State University, which is in Detroit. And so I enrolled there and I started getting involved in the local elections and the national elections. And as a Democrat, I was a registered Democrat, and I met other people that were canvassing and doing voter registration. So I did some voter registration for this for the Democratic Party in Detroit, and they were, very organized and everything. And they paired me up with a young man to go out door to door voter registration. And this was in the, I guess it was in the early 80s. And so there was this young African American man that they paired me up with, and they dropped us off at this, housing. It was housing develop. It was a, what do you call it? Subsidized housing. The projects basically. And so we were going to go door to door together. And then we thought, well, we'll cover more ground if we split up. And so let's just split up and I'll do this side and you do that side. So I started knocking on doors and a lot of people didn't answer at all. And then this very, very old woman came to the door, Black woman came to the door, and she opened up her door, and I told her, very earnestly what I was there to do, and I'd like to sign her up to vote. And she invited me in, and she had another, I think it's 2 other people there with her, 2 elders. And then, so these people were probably in their 80s, and they were listening to me, and I think they were just happy to have a visitor. And so they listened to me. They're very polite. And I had to read to them the voter registration card because they didn't know how to read. And then when I got to the part where you sign, they didn't know how to sign their name. So they had to sign an X. And that was a real eye opener for me. That one incident just like really woke me up. It's not like I went out the next day and became an anarchist, but it was definitely transformative for me to see that here I was trying to get them to vote for a Democrat when I knew that their lives wouldn't be changed one bit, no matter what they did. So I quit that. And then eventually I think I just didn't do any more political work for the Democrats or for anybody for a couple of years. And then once I graduated from Wayne State, I got a job in their office, in their administrative office. It was the financial aid department of Wayne State. So that I was just a clerk, like helping people fill out their forms and get money from the government so that they could go to school. And I met a coworker there who I really hit it off with, and she lived in the Cass corridor of Detroit, which was not where I lived, but a very bohemian neighborhood where it was kind of notorious, as like a Skid Row kind of place, and where artists live and all that. So she lived there, and I started hanging out with her, and I went to some kind of a political rally with her. I can't remember what it was, but we went downtown Detroit to this big rally, and I had a button on my jacket that said "Impeach Reagan," so it must have been like Reagan's second term. And one of her friends came up to chat with her, and she introduced me to him, and he looked at my button and he said, "Impeach Reagan? Why not impeach all presidents?" And I was like, "What?" I just could not imagine. What did you just say to me? Is that possible? So that was the first time I've heard of anarchism, and it wasn't even like the word. It was just like, wow, you cannot have a president. You can just impeach them all. That's a great idea. So that person happened to be, one of the people who lived in the Cass corridor and worked with the Fifth Estate newspaper, and did a lot of other stuff in the community. And so that's how I first got introduced to anarchism and the community of anarchists in Detroit. And that was it for me. I was sold. I loved it. I moved into the Cass corridor. I lived there for a number of years, and I met all kinds of great people. Some of them I'm still friends with today, including the person that told me we could impeach all presidents. And then I got involved with some of the stuff that they were doing. So they were very into environmental justice movement, and they were doing a lot of protests, and they were doing a lot of direct action. So, I mean, I was very much into direct action. That was my forte. That was where I felt I belonged. Direct action and small affinity groups, and coming up with ideas for direct actions. And so one of the things that they were working on that I kind of walked into was the Evergreen Alliance, which was a community group that was formed around protesting the building and opening of the largest trash incinerator in the world. And it was very bad for the environment, and it was built in the poorest neighborhood of Detroit, and the smoke was going to go downriver to the Native American communities. And so it just seemed like they were all doing that, and that's what I wanted to do too. So I joined into that group, and they were planning this big demonstration and outside of the incinerator where they were going to kind of do a blockade. And of course, I wanted to be part of that. And so a bunch of people volunteered to do direct action and do a sit-in, and we had trainings, and we planned this out very carefully. And the day of the big protest, the police didn't know what we were going to do. It was all very secretive, and so we all did this march, and we sat, like, there were 19 of us, so we were called the Evergreen 19 because we all got arrested. And they picked us up and put us on the buses and took us down to the police station and booked us, and we all got charged with misdemeanors for disturbing the peace or something. And there was a fairly I don't think it was more than a 2-week trial, but it was a trial. And the jury just acquitted all of us. And so it was a big celebration and everything. And it was really, really great. Like, just to have that camaraderie, and to have that community, and to have that affinity with those like-minded people. And, and afterwards, I felt sort of deflated because I knew that I never again wanted to give myself up to the cops. And even though there were lots of opportunities for, sitting in and getting arrested all the time, it just wasn't my thing. I didn't really want to take away the resources of the community, and I felt like, that's not where I'm going to be happy, is not getting arrested and giving myself up to the state. So I stopped doing that. I did other kinds of direct action where I was pretty sure that I would get away with it, and so so I continued to do work with the Evergreen Alliance and the Fifth Estate, and then that's through them I also met Marius Mason, who is a Green Scare prisoner serving 22 years in federal prison for direct action, basically. So Marius and I were, in the same affinity groups, and we did a lot of direct actions together in Detroit. And then Marius ended up doing a lot more risky direct actions, and I took a different turn. I just decided I didn't want to risk my freedom to make a statement. So Marius ended up we both left Detroit at some point, and we stayed in touch for a number of years when we were both in the same place at the same time. But eventually Marius did get arrested. I'll come back to Marius later on. The other thing I did when I was living in the Cass Quarter in probably the first or second year that I was living there, is I went to the Toronto anarchist gathering with the Fifth Estate group and a bunch of anarchists from Detroit. And that was transformative for me too. I just think sometimes, like, we got away with so much stuff. Like, you could never get away with this kind of stuff that we got away with. Like, there's cameras everywhere. And I was just thinking about Luigi Mangione. And there's no way that, he could have gotten away with that with all the cameras on him. But there weren't any cameras back then. There was very little surveillance. And there was just a lot of opportunity to do things and just to hide. And so Toronto Anarchist Gathering was among those things too, because there were big riots and big, police riots and everything. And we had to cross the border. We could never cross the border that easily now. We basically just needed a driver's license to cross the border. And, they could detain you, but they rarely did. And, we were traveling with a carload full of anarchists and going to this, radical gathering in Toronto, and no problem at all. We got back home safely. And another thing I participated in then was, a loose knit group we called the Midnight Club, and we would go out and do billboard alterations and, mostly like. And that was another thing, like, we could climb up on buildings and and just do whatever we wanted it was, in the dead of night, of course, but we would alter billboards, and then we would, run home, and it would all be so much fun. So I was involved with a group of anarcho-feminists also at that time, part of the, broader community. And we we wanted to start a community center. And that was another thing that was pretty easy back then. You could rent a space. Like, that area of Detroit, the Cass Corridor, is completely gentrified now. In fact, they've even changed the name so that it's not called that anymore. And, rents are exorbitant, and there's no radical activity anymore. But this was our playground. And so we rented this little storefront, probably about 1,000 square feet or something. And it was a decent building in good condition with a bathroom, working, plumbing, everything. And I think we paid like $150 a month for it. But we started a free store and a cafe, and we had poetry readings and movies. And next door, there was this empty vacant lot, and we would have full moon howls every every full moon, and all the community would come. We had bonfires, and then people that lived nearby were squatting in the house, like the house next door and two doors down. Were squatting, and so we let them use our electricity. So they just got extension cords so that they could have electricity into their homes. And it was all very, like mutual aid and community oriented. And so that lasted a few. Well, the part of the reason that we got the rent so cheap is because that building was slated for demolition, and they wouldn't have been able to do anything with it anyway, like long-term rent. So we had a month-to-month rent on it, and now it's gone, and there's a big Veterans Administration hospital in its place. So nothing really looks like it used to there. One time, Marius and I wanted to do a banner drop, and I don't know if you're familiar with Detroit's, border to Canada. There's two ways. There's a tunnel that goes under the Detroit River, and then there's a bridge that goes over the river. And in the tunnel, we had a friend drive us. This was so stupid. I have to, thinking back now, we had a friend drive us and drop us off in the tunnel. You're not allowed to stop the car in the tunnel. And you can't. There's nowhere to stop. It's just two-way traffic. There's nowhere to pull over. So he stopped and let us off, and we started to drop this banner. And within minutes, we were picked up by Border Patrol. I mean, literally minutes. I don't think we even got our banner unfurled. And plus, it was like full of exhaust fumes. It was like the worst place to be and to breathe. So we got detained, brought back to Detroit. We got detained, and they kept us for a while, and they were really mad, and then they let us go. So I don't think they'd ever encountered anything like that. So they really didn't know what to do with us. So they let us go. Eventually, Marius did some other actions related to that and got kicked out of Canada. So that's something I didn't want to happen to me either. I did not want to get kicked out of Canada. I went to Canada frequently. I had a good friend who lived there, Federico Arcos, who was this veteran of the Spanish Civil War. And he, I would go visit him, and a lot of us would go visit him on a regular basis, and he would come to Detroit too. So a lot of the ideas I got about history of anarchism, it came from him. And, he was a big proponent. And he always would say, I'm not good enough to be an anarchist, talking about himself because he had lost friends in the revolution who were anarchists as well. And I think it was, survivor's guilt that he didn't think that he deserved to be called an anarchist. So those were where some of my ideas came from. It's like you have to be fighting a revolution and risking your life to be a real anarchist, right? I graduated. I went to Wayne State again for my master's degree in library science, and so I finished that degree, and I knew that I still wanted to see the world. I wanted to travel, and I didn't want to be tied down to a job. So I took what was left of my student loan money, and I bought a one-way ticket to Barcelona, and I ended up traveling, and I had some friends there, and I visited some anarchist places in Spain and in other parts of Europe, and I ended up traveling for about 13 months in Europe. So backpacking and hitchhiking and taking trains and staying in hostels and camping and things that, we really can't do anymore. It's just like prohibitively expensive and dangerous. And so I came back from Europe, and I worked, some various odd jobs. And then I got a job at the University of Michigan's special collections, where I'm the curator of the Labadie collection, which is a collection of social protest movements, heavily focusing on anarchism, but also many other movements as well. And I've been there for 31 years now. So that's where I ended up, and I'd never found like that same type of community again. as I had in the Cass Corridor. A few years ago, about 2020, we were actually finally formed a union there, and now we have a union, and totally not anarchist activity at all, but I got elected to union steward. So I wanted to tell you more about Marius Mason because Marius got arrested, and when I found out Marius got arrested through the grapevine shortly after it happened, because I was still in touch with him, I contacted him about just like what's going on and what do you need. And so I ended up being the support on the support committee, where I still am to this day. It's been, I think, 2008 or so he got arrested um, and sentenced to 22 years in prison. And so I'm one of the main support people for Marius Mason, and I've continued to stay in touch and help out with, I talk to him at least once a week, and I help with fundraising to make sure that he gets what he needs in prison. And so that's been where a lot of my activities are now. My idea of anarchism is mutual aid, mainly cooperation, voluntary association, just being a good person, trying to be a good person, and trying to be helpful rather than hurtful. And sometimes that's not easy, in the world today. It's sometimes I try not to be too judgmental. Yeah, so the things that I believe are the things that I've learned through my community of people who call themselves anarchists or people who believe in anarchism. Well, I think what it's looked like for a long time, the same thing is, you know, they're present. They're maybe not so visible, but their ideals are there. The ideals that you put forth in your life and in your political work, in your ideas, in your writings, in your communities. And I've never shied away from people thinking that or calling me an anarchist, but I'm not even sure that that's what I call myself anymore. But I don't deny it if that's what you want to call me. But there has been so many people in the movement that talk about each other. Like one anarchist will say about another anarchist, oh, they're not a real anarchist, or uh, which really bothers me a lot, because who's to judge? Like, just because it's not the same type of anarchism that you practice doesn't mean that it's not anarchism. And so there's many different ways. And I know that there's even people that you've asked to be interviewed that have said that. And people have said that they probably say it about me, which is fine. I don't really care. I don't care if people think I'm an anarchist or think I'm not an anarchist. That's not my main focus. I just think that this is a great project, and I listened to a number of interviews. And at first, I wasn't sure when you were just starting out, and I just saw like a bunch of men being interviewed about about anarchism, and it's a lot of theory and everything. But the more I listened, the more I learned, and the more people I kind of got to know through these interviews. And even some people I do know, I got to know them better. And some organizations that I've heard of and known about, I found out, oh, that's the person who worked on that. That's really interesting. And now I know who they are. So I really appreciate that.